Abigail Whitmore threw herself between the creditor's men and the stable door, arms spread wide, shielding the last 3 horses her family owned. "You'll not take them," she said. "Not one." Her father lay dying inside that house, and every soul in the yard waited to watch her break. She did not break. And the ragged stranger leaning on her fence, the man she'd soon beg for help, was no drifter at all. If you believe a good woman deserves to be seen at last, subscribe. Stay with me to the very end and tell me in the comments what town you're watching from so I can follow how far this story rides. The first thing Josiah Crane did when he rode onto the Whitmore land was spit in the dirt like he owned it. "Whitmore!" he shouted at the house. "Thomas Whitmore, you come out here and face me like a man, or I'll drag your daughter out to do it for you." Abigail was already crossing the yard before he finished. She had a bridle in one hand and hay dust on her sleeves, and she did not slow down. "My father's abed, Mr. Crane," she said. "Whatever you've come to say, you'll say it to me." Crane looked her over the way a man looks at a horse he means to buy cheap. He had 2 others with him, big fellows on borrowed mounts, and behind them, a wagon that meant business. "Then hear it plain, miss," Crane said. "Your father owes my employer $412. Note came due at planting. It's July now. He's paid nothing. He's been sick since the spring. Sickness ain't a payment I can carry to the bank. I'm asking you for time. You've had time." Crane swung down off his horse. His boots hit the ground hard. "What I've got is a lawful claim on livestock tack and grain to settle the sum. I'll start with the horses." He nodded to his men and they moved toward the stable, and that was when Abigail ran. She got there first. She put her back to the door and her arms out across it, and she looked so small in front of those 2 men that a woman watching from the road put a hand over her mouth. "You'll not take them," Abigail said. "Step aside, girl. Those horses are how we work this land. Take them and there's no crop, and there's no money, and you've killed us for $400 you could have had at harvest. Step aside." "Over my body," she said, and her voice shook, but her arms did not come down. By now, there were maybe 15 people gathered at the fence line. Word travels fast when a girl's about to be ruined. Nobody moved to help her. That was the way of it. The Whitmores had been proud when they had money, and folks have long memories for pride. Crane sighed like she was a chore. "Boys." And one of the men reached out and took Abigail by the arm, not gentle, and started to pull her off the door. "Let go of me," she said. "Come on now. Let go." "That's enough." The voice came from the fence. It wasn't loud. That was the strange thing about it. Every person there had been shouting or whispering, and this voice just said 3 words at a normal pitch, and somehow the whole yard heard it. A man stood at the rail. Trail-worn coat dust on his hat, a saddlebag over one shoulder like he'd walked a long way. His boots were cracked. His jaw hadn't seen a razor in days. He looked like exactly what the county was full of that summer, a man with no work and no place drifting between farms looking for a day's labor and a plate of food. "This ain't your business, stranger," Crane said. "No," the man agreed. "It ain't." But he came through the gate anyway, slow, and he set his saddlebag down on the ground, and he tipped his hat back so they could see his eyes. "But I've been standing here 5 minutes watching 2 grown men handle a young woman like a sack of feed, and I find I can't keep walking till I've said my piece." "And what piece is that?" "That there's law about how you collect a debt, and there's no law says you get to put your hands on her to do it." The stranger looked at the man holding Abigail's arm. "Son, let her go, or I'll make you wish you had." There was a silence. The man let go. Abigail rubbed her arm and stared at the stranger, and did not thank him because she didn't know yet whether he'd made things better or worse. Crane recovered quick. "You want to make yourself useful, drifter? Then here's a thing you can carry to your friends on the road. The Whitmore place is finished. Come August, it'll be sold at auction, and everything on it with it." He turned back to Abigail. $412. I'll give you 3 days out of what's left of my patience. 3 days, miss. Then I come back with the sheriff, and I take it all: horses, grain, and the roof over your dying father's head. You understand me. I understand you fine, Abigail said. 3 days. You've said it twice. I heard you the first time. Crane's face went red. He climbed back on his horse. 3 days, he said. A third time, because some men can't help themselves, and then he wheeled around and rode off his men and his empty wagon behind him, and the crowd at the fence began to drift away. Disappointed there had been no ruin to watch. Abigail stood at the stable door until the last of them was gone. Then, and only then, her knees gave a little, and she caught herself on the doorframe, and she breathed like she'd been underwater. The stranger picked up his saddlebag. You all right, miss? I'm fine. You don't look fine. I don't much care how I look. She straightened. She wiped her hands on her apron and got her face back under control, and when she turned to him she was calm again, or near enough. I owe you thanks, I suppose. You don't owe me anything. Then I'll thank you anyway, and then I'll ask you to be on your way, because I've got 3 days to find $400 and I can't stand here talking. The stranger didn't move. He looked at the stable and the fence and the fields past it and the house. Who's working this place with you? He asked. What? The land. Who works it? I do. Alone. My father's sick, and my mother's dead, and I've got no brothers. So yes, Mr. Alone. Why, you writing a book. He almost smiled. Because I'm looking for work, he said. And you've got a lot of it, and no hands to do it with, and 3 days to make a miracle. Seems to me those two facts might be of use to each other. Abigail laughed, short, tired, without any humor in it. I can't pay you. I didn't ask to be paid. Every man asks to be paid. I'm asking for a roof and a plate, he said. You've got a barn. I can sleep there, and I'll wager you a day's food that with 2 of us working instead of 1, you find your way clearer by tonight than you would alone. She studied him a long moment. It was the sort of look her father had taught her, the look you give a horse you don't know, checking the eyes, the stance whether the animal's honest or the kind that'll bite you when you turn your back. What's your name? Nate, he said. It was true as far as it went. Nate Harper. He'd chosen the name careful. It was his own Christian name, and near enough his own surname that he wouldn't fail to answer to it. Nathaniel Harper had learned over 4 years of doing this, that a lie you had to think about was a lie you'd get caught in, because that's what he was doing. Nathaniel Harper, who owned 1,100 acres and the mill and half the notes in the valley, who had a house with 14 rooms and a mother who'd been trying to marry him off since he was 25, stood in a poor girl's yard in a dead man's coat, calling himself a drifter, and he did it on purpose. He'd done it 4 times before. It was, he'd decided, the only honest way left to him to find out what a person was. Well, Nate Harper, Abigail said. I can't promise you'll get paid, and I can't promise this place'll be standing come August. But if you want to work, there's work, and the barn's dry, and there's cornbread and beans, which is more than I can say for grander things. That'll do? Then put your bag down and follow me. First thing you can do is help me figure out how a girl finds $400 in 3 days, because I'll be honest with you, mister, I haven't the faintest idea. The inside of the house told him more in 1 minute than the girl had told him in 10. There was no clutter of wealth anywhere. A clean swept floor. 2 chairs by the hearth where there'd once clearly been 6, he could see the marks in the boards. A wall where pictures had hung and been sold. And a man in the back bedroom propped on pillows so thin the blankets barely rose over him. Papa, Abigail said, and her whole voice changed. Every hard edge went out of it. Papa, we've company. This is Mr. Harper. He's going to help us with the harvest. Thomas Whitmore turned his head on the pillow. His eyes were the same gray as his daughter's, and just as sharp, even sick as he was. Can we pay him? The old man rasped. We'll manage. Abigail, can we pay him? She didn't answer. The old man closed his eyes. So that's how it is. That's how it is, sir, Nathaniel said, stepping forward and taking his hat off. And I'll tell you what I told your daughter. I'm not asking for wages. Just a place to sleep and a plate at your table. I've had a hard summer, and I'd rather be useful than idle. Thomas Whitmore looked at him for a long time. "You talk soft for a hired man," he said at last. Nathaniel went still. It was the same trap every time. The clean hands, the straight teeth. The way a man says his words, these things gave you away if you weren't careful. He'd learned to slouch. He'd learned to eat with his elbows out. But he could never quite unlearn the way he talked, because it had been beaten into him at a schoolhouse his father paid dear for. "I had schooling once," he said, "before my luck turned. Reckon it stuck to my mouth even after everything else got taken." That was the right answer. He watched it land. Thomas Whitmore's face softened into something almost like fellowship, one ruined man to another. "Everything gets taken," the old man murmured. "Sooner or later. Abigail. See, he's fed." "Yes, Papa." Out in the main room, she stopped him with a hand that didn't quite touch his sleeve. "He wasn't always like that," she said quietly. "Weak. He built this place with his own 2 hands, 40 years. And now a man like Crane rides in and spits in the yard, and there's not a thing my father can do but lie there and listen." "How'd the debt happen?" She hesitated. "You don't have to tell me." "No," she said. "You're sleeping in my barn, and you've thrown yourself between me and 2 men you don't know. You've a right to know what house you've walked into." She sat down at the table. She folded her hands. 2 years ago, a man came through the valley buying up notes, buying up debt. Small farms, the ones that borrowed against a bad year. My father borrowed against a bad year once long ago, paid most of it back, still owed a little. This man bought that little debt off the bank. What man? Edmund Blackwell. Nathaniel kept his face empty, but inside him, something went cold and quiet. He knew that name. "Go on," he said. He was pleasant about it at first. Rode out, tipped his hat, called me miss, called my father a fine man of the soil. Said he'd carry the note easy, no hurry, no interest to speak of. And then, she made a small bitter gesture, and then the surveyors came. Surveyors. For the new road. The state road, the one they mean to run from the river to Lancaster. And do you know where the surveyors say it's going to run? She looked at him. Right along the bottom of our south field, right through the crook of the creek. Our land, Mr. Harper, is about to be worth 10 times what it was, because whoever owns it owns the crossing. And whoever owns the crossing owns the tolls and the mills and the whole trade of this valley for 100 years. Nathaniel already knew about the road. He'd bought 40 acres on the far side of the creek 2 years back for that exact reason. What he hadn't known, what nobody had told him, was that Edmund Blackwell was here working the other bank, working it dirty. And suddenly, Abigail went on. Mr. Blackwell isn't so patient anymore. Suddenly the little note he bought so kindly is a knife at our throats. He's called in Crane. He wants us gone. And he's made it clear as spring water how we could all keep our land and our comfort and our good name if I'd only be reasonable. How's that? By marrying him, she said flatly. He's asked 3 times. Each time the note gets bigger and the smile gets thinner. Marry Edmund Blackwell, and the debt disappears, and Papa lives out his days in his own bed, and I get to be mistress of half the valley. She stood up abruptly and went to the window and put her back to him. And all I have to do is spend the rest of my life beside a man who bought my father's ruin like a card in a game and dealt it out slow, just to watch me squirm. The room was quiet. You said no, Nathaniel said. I said no. 3 times. 3 times. Even though it had saved the farm. She turned around, and her eyes were bright and hard. There are things worth more than a farm, Mr. Harper. I know that's a strange thing for a poor woman to say. But my mother married for love, and my father worked 40 years beside her, and I watched them, and I know what it looks like when 2 people build something true. And I would rather lose this land and everything on it than wake up every morning next to a man who thinks he bought me. She wiped at her eyes, angry at them for filling. There. Now you know the whole ugly business. Still want your plate of beans. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. He'd spent 4 years and worn 4 different men's coats, trying to find out one thing about the people around him, whether stripped of what he could give them, they were good. He had almost stopped believing the answer could be yes. He had come to this farm expecting one more grasping girl, one more careful set of eyes measuring the size of the fortune behind a title. And instead, here was the woman about to lose everything offered a way to keep it saying no, because the price was her honor. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and his voice was rougher than he meant it. "I'll take the beans." They worked till dark that first day. He'd expected her to give him the light chores that was the tell the way the soft-handed sorted themselves. Instead, she handed him an axe and pointed at a cord of oak. "Can you swing that, or is it just for looks?" "I can swing it." "Then swing it. And I'll go see about the fence in the north pasture, because a rail's down, and if the mare gets into the corn, we lose the corn, and if we lose the corn, we lose the argument I'm having with Mr. Crane." She was gone before he could answer. He split wood for 2 hours. It felt good if he was honest. There was no one to perform for out there behind the barn, no drawing room, no mother steering some banker's daughter toward him across a parlor. Just the wood and the ache building honest in his shoulders. When the light started going, he carried an armload up toward the house and heard her before he saw her. "Easy, easy, girl. I've got you." He came around the barn at a run. The mare was down. Not the corn-thieving one from the pasture in Old Gray in the near stall, a horse he hadn't looked at close, and she was on her side in the straw with her legs stiff and her belly swollen tight as a drum, and Abigail was on her knees in the muck with her whole arm across the animal's neck. "What is it?" he said. "Colic. Bad. She's twisting up inside." Abigail didn't look up. "I've seen it kill in a night. We have to get her up. We have to walk her. Keep her walking or she'll roll and twist her gut, and that's the end. Help me get her up." He dropped the wood and got down in the straw. "On 3, she said. "Nate, on 3 you pull the halter, I'll get behind. Ready. 1, 2. They hauled. The mare heaved, screamed, thrashed, and got her forelegs under her, and then she was up, staggering, and Abigail had the lead and was already moving. "Walk her. Just walk her. All night if we have to." "All night? You wanted work," she said, half laughing, half crying. "This is the work." So they walked the horse, around the yard and around it again, one on each side in the dark, while the summer bugs sang, and the old mare groaned, and now and then tried to buckle, and they wouldn't let her. And somewhere in the second hour, with the sweat cold on both their backs, Abigail started to talk. Not about the debt, not about Blackwell. Just talk the kind that comes out of a person when they're too tired to guard it. "Her name's Juno," she said. "My father gave her to me when I was 9. She was a filly then. I learned to ride on her." A pause. "Papa said a person can tell everything they need to know about a soul by how it treats an animal that can't do anything for it. He said that's the truest test there is. Because a horse can't pay you back and can't tell anyone how you behaved, so however you treat it, that's just who you are, when no one's counting." Nathaniel Harper walked a poor girl's dying horse around a dirt yard in the dark and felt something turn over in his chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time. "That's a good test," he said quietly. "It's the only one that's never wrong," she said. The mare lived. Somewhere near dawn, the crisis broke. The animal passed what she needed to pass, and her belly loosened, and her eyes cleared, and Abigail put her forehead against the horse's neck and stayed there a long moment, and Nathaniel looked away to give her the privacy of it. "She'll do now," Abigail said, finally thick-voiced. "She'll do." She turned. She looked at him, dirty exhausted straw in his hair, the fine drawing-room manners scrubbed clean off him by a night in the muck. "You didn't have to stay out here all night, Mr. Harper. There's not a wage in the world for what you just did. You could have slept." "I know," he said. "Then why?" He couldn't tell her the truth, so he told her a different true thing. "Because a horse can't pay you back," he said, "and I reckon that's a good enough reason to help one." She stared at him, and for the first time since he'd ridden onto that ruined land, Abigail Whitmore looked at the stranger in her barnyard like he might be someone worth knowing. Edmund Blackwell came the next afternoon. Nathaniel was up on the barn roof mending a hole when he heard the fine horse on the road. You could always tell a fine horse the gait was different. And he flattened himself against the shingles and watched a man in a bottle green coat ride into the yard like a lord surveying his tenants. "Abigail," the man called. Not Miss Whitmore. Abigail, warm and easy, the way a man says a name he thinks he already owns. "Abigail, my dear, come and let me look at you." She came out. She did not hurry. "Mr. Blackwell." "Edmund. How many times must I ask Edmund?" He swung down all grace, and Nathaniel got his first good look at the man who'd bought a valley's worth of misery. Handsome, in a polished way. Soft hands. A watch chain worth more than the Whitmore Farm's whole herd. "I heard the most distressing thing in town. That awful man Crane making a scene in your very yard. I came the moment I heard." "Did you?" Abigail said. "Abigail!" Blackwell put a hand to his heart. "You wound me. You think I sent him. After everything, after all my forbearance, you think I'd sick a dog like that on you." He stepped closer. "The truth, my dear, is that Crane works for the bank now as well as for me. And the bank has its own claims, and there is a limit to what even I can hold back on your behalf. 3 days he told you, I can make it 30. I can make it a year. I can make it disappear entirely." A softer step. "You know how." "I know how?" Abigail said. "The answer is the same as it was in April and in May and in June." Blackwell's pleasant face didn't change, but something moved behind it, quick and cold, like a fish under ice. "You're proud," he said. "I admire it, truly. But pride is a thing for people who can afford it, Abigail. And you?" He gestured around the yard at the sold-off gaps where wealth used to be. "Forgive me, my dear, but you cannot afford it much longer. Your father is dying. When he goes, you'll be a woman alone with a mountain of debt and a road coming that everyone in 3 counties wants a piece of. Do you imagine they'll let you keep it? A girl, they'll take it from you the way you take a toy from a child, and they won't even trouble to be gentle. I am the only gentle hand you will ever be offered." "Chodite." "Teen. Then I'll take the ungentle ones," Abigail said, "and keep my own name while I lose." Up on the roof, Nathaniel's fists closed on the shingles. Blackwell laughed. He actually laughed delighted, like she'd said something charming. "God, you're magnificent. Do you know that's why I want you, not the land?" "Well," a thin smile, "not only the land. It's that fire. Any fool can buy acreage. But a woman who'll stand in a burning house and spit at the man holding water, that's rare, Abigail. That's worth waiting for." He pulled his gloves back on. "I'll go. But I'll be at the harvest assembly at the end of the month, and so will you, because your father, God keep him, is still an invited man of this county, whether he can stand or not, and I will ask you there, in front of everyone. And you will have to give me your answer in front of everyone, too." He mounted his fine horse. "Think in the meantime about how it will look. The proud Whitmore girl refusing salvation in a room full of the people who watched her fall. Think about whether your pride is worth their pity." He rode off. Abigail stood in the yard, and this time there was no crowd to be brave for, and Nathaniel watched from the roof as her shoulders came down slow, inch by inch, until she was just a tired woman standing alone in the dirt. He climbed down. "I heard," he said before she could pretend otherwise. "I was on the roof. I heard the whole of it." She didn't have the strength left to be embarrassed. "Then you heard a man tell me the truth I've been trying not to say to myself. He's right. When Papa's gone, they'll take it. All of it. And Edmund Blackwell will be standing there with an open hand, looking like the only mercy in the world." "He's not a mercy." "No," she said. "He's a wolf with good manners, but a wolf with good manners still eats, and I'm out of ways to keep the door shut." Nathaniel stood there, a rich man, in a poor man's clothes, holding inside him the power to end this whole thing with a single word, one letter to his lawyer, one word to the bank that half belonged to him. He could pay $400 the way she'd pay for a spool of thread. He could crush Edmund Blackwell like a beetle under a boot heel, and if he did it now, if he stepped forward and said, "Miss Whitmore, I am not what I seem. I am Nathaniel Harper of Harper's Mill, and I will fix all of this. He would never ever know what he had come here to learn. Whether she was good when there was nothing to be gained. Whether the fire was real or just another woman's clever performance for a fortune she hadn't yet guessed was standing in her barnyard. He hated himself a little for the next thing he said. But he said it. 3 days to find $400, he said. Let's stop talking about the wolf and start finding the money. What can we sell that isn't the horses and isn't the land? She looked at him, and something like gratitude flickered across her exhausted face. Gratitude that he'd said we. There's my mother's things, she said slowly. A brooch. A set of silver. Papa never let me sell them, said they were the last of her. But Papa's not the one Crane's coming for. She swallowed. And there's the North wool. 2 years of clip I've been saving to sell whole. If I take it to the merchant in town tomorrow, and he gives me a fair price, which he won't because he never does, maybe we get halfway there. Then we get halfway there tomorrow, Nathaniel said, and we find the other half the day after. Halfway isn't nowhere. You keep saying we. I keep meaning it. She looked at him a beat too long. Then she turned toward the house brisk again, because brisk was how she kept from breaking. Wash up, she said. There's beans. And Mr. Harper? She paused in the doorway. Thank you. For the horse, for the roof, for the we. She didn't wait for an answer. Beans are getting cold. The merchant's name was Hollis, and he cheated her in front of the whole town. Nathaniel walked in beside her the next morning, hat low, saying nothing, because a hired man doesn't speak for his employer in a shop. He watched her lay out 2 years of careful work, the wool clean, and sorted the best in the valley, and everyone in that store knew it. I'll give you 11 cents the pound, Hollis said. It's worth 20, and you know it, Mr. Hollis. It's worth what a buyer'll pay, and I'm the only buyer, and I'll pay 11. There are buyers in Lancaster. Then take it to Lancaster. Hollis smiled and leaned on his counter and let his voice carry to the half-dozen townsfolk pretending not to listen. But it's a 2-day haul, and you've got what I hear about 2 days left before Crane takes your wagon out from under you. So. He spread his hands, reasonable, cruel. 11 cents. Or haul it home. Abigail's jaw worked. Someone in the corner of the store snickered. Nathaniel didn't see who, but he saw Abigail hear it, saw the color come up her neck, saw the whole weight of the thing land on her. The town's pleasure at watching a proud family brought low the note in that laugh that said, "Good, let her learn. Who did she think she was?" And he saw her master it. 12, she said. Steady. 12 cents the pound. Mr. Hollis and I walk out of here and tell every farmer between the creek and the pike that you robbed the Whitmore girl in her worst week for the price of a cheap laugh, and they can decide for themselves who to sell their clip to come autumn. 12. Or you can enjoy that snicker and lose the whole valley's wool over $1 worth of spite. The store went quiet. Hollis's smile faded. 11.5, he muttered. 12. 12, Hollis said, sour as a green apple. Robbery. Yes, Abigail said sweetly. It is. Weigh it out. Nathaniel stood by the door and did not smile, though he wanted to. He carried the wool to the scale. He watched her take the money, less than half of what she needed, and hard won even at that, and fold it into her dress with hands that only shook a little, and thank the merchant with a courtesy she plainly didn't feel, and walk out of that store with her chin up while the whole town watched. Outside in the road she stopped. She looked at the little roll of bills in her palm. Then she looked up at the sky and breathed out slow, and when she spoke, her voice was very quiet. It's not enough, she said. You know that. It's $180 against $412, and I've got 1 day left, and I've sold my wool, and I've still got to sell my mother's silver, and even then. She stopped. She pressed her lips together. She would not cry in the road. She had refused all week to give this town that. Nathaniel Harper stood beside her with $400 in his saddlebag, back in her barn, sewn into the lining of a coat that wasn't really his, and said nothing, because to speak would be to reveal himself, and because he had made a promise to a rule he'd lived by for 4 years. But he looked at her, at this woman who'd faced down 2 hired thugs at a stable door, who'd walked a dying horse till dawn for the sake of a soul that couldn't pay her back, who'd stared down a whole shop full of people hungry to watch her break, and made a cheating merchant give her 1 more penny out of pure iron nerve. And he understood, standing in that dusty road, that his rule and his caution and his 4 years of hiding had finally run out of ground to stand on. He had come to the Whitmore farm to find out whether a good woman still existed. He had found her, and now the only question left was what kind of man he was going to be about it. "One day left," Abigail said mostly to herself, closing her hand around the pitiful roll of money. "One day, well, I've done impossible things on less." She squared her shoulders and turned and started walking home. And Nathaniel Harper picked up the reins and followed her down the road, a rich man in a dead man's coat, carrying a secret that was getting heavier by the hour, watching the straight, strong line of her back and knowing the way. You know a storm is coming by the smell of the air, that he was already hopelessly and against every rule he had ever made for himself, halfway to being in love. She sold the silver that same afternoon, and it broke something in her to do it. Nathaniel drove her back to town in the wagon, and she held the little cloth bundle in her lap the whole way, and she didn't say a word for 2 miles. When she finally spoke, she wasn't really speaking to him. "My mother wore this brooch the day she married Papa," she said. "She wore it to my christening. She was buried in her second best, because Papa couldn't bear to put the good one in the ground." Her thumb moved over the cloth. "And now I'm going to hand it to a man behind a counter for whatever coins he feels like giving me, and by 3 more days of a fight, I'm probably going to lose anyway." "You don't have to sell it." "Yes, I do." "Abigail, don't." She turned on the seat and looked at him, and her eyes were dry and terrible. "Don't you tell me what I don't have to do. You've been here 4 days. You don't know what this costs. So please, Mr. Harper, just drive the wagon." He drove the wagon. The jeweler gave her $60 for a brooch worth $200, and she took it because that was the week she was having, and she walked out of that shop and got up on the wagon seat and stared straight ahead and said, "240. We've got 240 against 412. Take me home." But they didn't get home, because Crane was waiting at the crossroads. He wasn't alone this time. He had the sheriff with him, a heavy, sweating man named Dolph who wouldn't meet Abigail's eye, and a paper in his hand, and he held it up as the wagon came even with him. "Change of plans, Miss Whitmore?" Crane called. "My employer's grown impatient. This here's a writ. Says I don't have to wait 3 days after all. Says I can take possession of secured property today, this afternoon, right now." The blood went out of Abigail's face. "You said 3 days. I said a lot of things. The paper says today." "Sheriff?" Abigail turned to Dolph. "Sheriff, he gave his word in front of 15 witnesses." "The writ's lawful, Abigail," Dolph muttered, still not looking at her. "I checked it myself. Judge signed it this morning. There ain't anything I can do." And Nathaniel, sitting beside her on the wagon seat, understood in one cold instant exactly what Blackwell had done. He'd moved the date up on purpose. Not to collect, he could collect any time. He'd moved it up so that Abigail would arrive at the harvest assembly, already ruined, already homeless, already stripped of every last thing, so that when he stood up in front of the whole county and offered his hand, she would have nothing left to refuse him with. He wasn't trying to take the farm. He was trying to take her only reason to say no. "How much?" Nathaniel said. Crane blinked at him. "What?" "How much on the writ, today, to make it go away?" "The full sum, Drifter. $412, and it don't matter, because she's got 100 of it if she's got a dime, so climb down off that wagon, miss, and let's—" "She's got 240, Nathaniel said, "and I've got the rest." The road went quiet. Abigail turned and stared at him. "You've got what?" Crane said. Nathaniel had already made the decision somewhere back on that road outside the jeweler's, watching her hold $60 for her dead mother's brooch. He was done. Not with the disguise he wasn't ready for that yet couldn't unmake 4 days in one breath, but done letting her drown while he sat on dry land with a rope in his hand. He reached inside his coat into the seam he'd sewn himself, and he pulled out folded banknotes, and he counted them into his own palm where everyone could see. 172, he said, and held it out level. 240 and 172 makes 412. Count it, Crane. It's all there. Crane didn't take it. He stared at the money like it was a snake. Where's a hired hand get $172? Same place any man gets money. Worked for it. Saved it. Nathaniel's voice didn't waver. You going to stand there asking a working man where he keeps his savings, or are you going to take a lawful payment and give this woman a receipt? Because I'll tell you what the judge won't like. Crane, an officer of the court, refusing good coin on a debt just because a rich man wants the girl kept poor. That's a thing a lawyer could make noise about. Ain't it, Sheriff? Dolph shifted in his saddle. He's not wrong, Crane. Money's money. If he pays it, the writ's satisfied. That's the law. Crane's face was a war between greed and fury. He looked at the money. He looked at Abigail, who was sitting perfectly still, white as a sheet, staring at the man beside her, like she'd never seen him before in her life. He looked back at the money, and he took it. He counted it twice slow, hunting for a short bill that wasn't there. Then he pulled a book from his coat, scrawled a line, tore out a page, and threw it into the wagon bed like it was garbage. Paid in full, he spat. Enjoy your dirt farm, miss. My employer'll be sorry to hear it, but I don't expect he'll be sorry long. He wheeled his horse. There's more than one way to skin a proud cat. You tell your... He shot a poisonous look at Nathaniel. Your generous hired man, that too. Then he was gone. The sheriff trailing after him with his eyes on the ground, and Abigail Whitmore sat in a wagon at a crossroads holding a receipt that said her family was saved, and she did not look relieved. She looked afraid. Drive, she said quietly. Abigail, drive the wagon, Mr. Harper. Take us up the road out of sight of this crossing, and then you are going to stop and you are going to tell me the truth, because a drifter does not carry $172 sewn into his coat, and I am not a fool. He drove. He got them up the road and around the bend past the hedgerow out of sight of the crossroads, and then he stopped the wagon and set the brake and turned to her, and for one long moment he stood at the very edge of telling her everything. He didn't jump. I told you I had a hard summer, he said. I didn't tell you what came before it. I had money once, Abigail. Real money. My family, we had land up north, and it went bad the way these things go, the way it's going for your father now. Bank and debt and men in green coats. True enough that it didn't burn to say it. That money's the last of what I saved before it all went. I've carried it 2 years, slept on it, nearly starved rather than spend it, because it was the last thing that was mine. He met her eyes. And I spent it on you. Because I watched you sell your mother's brooch for $60 this morning, and I couldn't watch you lose the farm too. That's the truth of the money. That's all of it. It was a lie. It was also somehow the most honest thing he'd said in 4 years. Because every word about not being able to watch her lose was true down to the marrow. Abigail searched his face for a long, long time. You spent everything you had, she said slowly. Everything. On a family you met 4 days ago. Yes. Why? You know why. I don't. I truly don't. Men don't do this. Men want something. What do you want, Nate Harper? Say it plain and let me hear it, because I've spent all summer with a man who wants me for my land, and I'll be damned if I trade one wolf for another, just because this one splits my firewood. And there it was. The thing he admired most in her, the fire turned full on him. She wasn't grateful. She was suspicious. She'd been taught by a hard summer that a gift is just a debt that hasn't shown its teeth yet, and she was too smart and too burned to swoon over a man who'd handed her a rescue. He could have told her the truth right then. Part of him screamed too. Instead, he told her the deepest true thing he could without breaking the disguise. I don't want your land, he said. I don't want your farm. I've had land, and I've had it taken, and I promise you it's not worth what it costs. And I don't want you either, not the way he means it, not as a thing to own. He held her eyes. I spent my money because 4 days ago, I'd about decided there wasn't a soul left in this world who'd do a hard thing for nothing. And then I watched you walk a dying horse till dawn. And I thought maybe I was wrong. Maybe there's one. And I found I'd rather be broke and right about that than rich and right about the other. That's all I want, Abigail. To have been wrong about people. You've made me wrong. That's worth $172 to a man like me. She didn't say anything. She looked away out over the fields, and she was quiet for so long he thought he'd said too much. Then she said in a small, unsteady voice, completely unlike her, "Take us home, Nate. Papa'll want to hear he's not being put out of his bed today." And when he clicked to the horse and the wagon started rolling, he saw her wipe her eyes fast with the back of her hand and pretend she hadn't. Thomas Whitmore wept when she told him, openly without shame, a dying man crying at the news that he'd die in his own house. He gripped Nathaniel's hand with what strength he had left and couldn't speak, and Abigail had to lead her father back to his pillow, while the old man kept turning to look at the stranger who'd emptied his pockets for people he owed nothing. That night, Abigail cooked more than beans. She killed a hen. She made a real supper, the first the house had seen in months, and she set 3 places, and she made Nathaniel sit at the table, instead of taking his plate to the barn, and when he protested, she said, "A man who spends his last dollar for my father eats at my father's table. Sit down, Nate, that's not a request." He sat down. And over that supper, for the first time, the two of them talked like two people, instead of an employer and a hand, about small things, foolish things, the way a soul does when a great weight has just come off it. She laughed. He'd never heard her laugh. It came out of her rusty like a gate that hadn't swung in a while, and it undid him a little, and he thought, "God help me," and passed her the bread. For 8 days after that, it was almost happiness. The work was still hard, and the future still dark, but the knife was off their throats, and something grew in that space. He mended the fence she'd been fighting for weeks. She taught him the trick of the well pump that stuck. They brought in the early hay together, the two of them, and old Juno recovered and strong. And at the end of a long day, they'd sit on the porch step, her father dozing inside, the light going, and not talk. And the not talking was easy. He learned things about her. That she'd wanted as a girl to be a school teacher before her mother died and the farm swallowed her whole. That she read every book she could get, and there weren't many. That she was funnier than she let herself be, and kinder than she let anyone see, and that under the iron she'd forged to survive, there was a young woman who'd never once been allowed to just be young. And she learned things about him that were all true, because he was careful to only tell her true things. That he had no family living, true. That he'd loved someone once, and it had ended badly, true, a girl who'd turned out to want his father's name. That he was tired in a way that went past the body, truest of all. What she didn't learn was the one thing. And every day, he didn't tell her, the not telling got heavier until it sat on his chest at night in the barn like a stone. Because he could feel it now, plainly, the thing he'd sworn he'd never let a disguise become. This had started as a test. It wasn't a test anymore. And a test you keep running after, you know the answer isn't a test. It's just a lie. He told himself at the assembly. He would tell her at the assembly. He would stand up when Blackwell stood up, and he would end it all in one stroke, reveal himself, ruin the wolf, and lay the whole truth at her feet, and let her strike him if she wanted to. He told himself he had time. He was wrong. It fell apart on the 9th day, and it fell apart fast. A rider came up the road mid-morning, not Crane, not Blackwell. A young man? Nathaniel didn't recognize, well-dressed in a hurry. Abigail was in the yard. Nathaniel was up on the barn roof again, and he flattened against the shingles out of long habit the second he heard fine tack, and so he heard the whole thing. "Miss Whitmore," the young man called. "Miss Abigail Whitmore." "That's me. I'm to deliver a message, miss, and I've ridden hard to do it, so forgive my manners." He didn't dismount. "There's a man of business come to town this morning asking after property in the valley. A lawyer from Philadelphia. He's inquiring on behalf of a client who owns land hereabouts, and he's been asking particular whether anyone's seen the client himself, a Mr. Nathaniel Harper." Says Mr. Harper left his estate near 2 weeks past and hasn't been heard from. And there's business piling up needs his hand and half the county's looking for him. The young man leaned down. You've hired hands, I hear. Drifters, working men passing through. I've been sent to every farm on this road to ask the same thing, miss, and I'll ask you. Have you seen or heard of a gentleman named Nathaniel Harper? Tall, dark-haired, near 30, might be traveling rough. There's a reward for word of him. Up on the roof, Nathaniel Harper stopped breathing. And down in the yard, Abigail said, No, I've never heard the name. I've got one hand, and he's a working man from up north who's never had a gentleman's dollar in his life. Sorry to disappoint you. You're certain, miss? I'm certain. Good luck to you. Try the Coyle place 2 miles on. The young man tipped his hat and rode off, and Abigail Whitmore stood alone in the yard for a moment. Then very slowly, she turned, and she lifted her head, and she looked straight up at the roof of the barn at the exact spot where a man was pressed flat against the shingles, trying not to exist. And she said in a voice with no warmth left in it at all, Come down, Mr. Harper, or should I say come down, Mr. Harper, since it seems the name fits either way. He came down. There was no point in anything else. He climbed down the ladder into a yard that felt like it had dropped 40 degrees, and he stood in front of her, and she looked at him with her arms folded and her face like stone. And he understood that she had known. Maybe not everything, but something. She'd known long enough to lie to that writer without a flicker to protect a secret she hadn't even confirmed yet, and now she was going to make him say it out loud. How long have you known? He said. You talk like a schoolmaster, and you carry a rich man's savings, and you count money like you've handled a great deal of it, and never once in 9 days have you told me the name of a single town you've supposedly worked in. Her voice was flat and dangerous. I'm a farmer, Nate. I spend my life watching for the thing that's wrong. You've been wrong since the first hour. I just didn't want to be right. She unfolded her arms. So say it. Say your whole name. I've earned that much, haven't I? Say it to my face. Nathaniel Harper. Of Harper's Mill, in Bradford County. He made himself hold her eyes while he said it. I own 1,100 acres up north and the mill and the notes on half the farms in this valley, including, his voice caught, including the one your father borrowed against. The note Blackwell bought. It was mine before it was the bank's. I sold it 2 years ago and never knew what became of it or who it was ruining. Until I came here. Abigail took that like a blow. She actually rocked back a half step. You own... She stopped. She pressed her hand to her mouth. Then she took the hand away and asked the worst question, the only one that mattered. The money you gave Crane, the $172 you said was the last of everything you had. The money my father wept over. The money I've been telling myself I'd spend the rest of my life repaying to a good poor man who bankrupted himself for us. Her voice climbed. Was that your last dollar, Nathaniel, or was it pocket change? He couldn't answer. Was it pocket change? It was pocket change, he said. She hit him. Open-handed hard across the face, and he let her didn't move, didn't lift a hand, and the crack of it rang across the yard. You let my father cry, she said, and now her voice was shaking apart. You held his hand while he thanked you for giving up everything you owned, and it was pocket change. It was nothing. It was a coin you found in the road, and you let him weep over it. You let me lie awake nights feeling like I owed you my soul. You sat at my mother's table and ate my chicken and let me think you were... Her voice broke completely. Let me think you were like us, poor and honest and worn down to nothing and good anyway. And the whole time you were a rich man playing a game. Testing me, weren't you? That's what this is. You came here to test the poor farm girl and see if she was worthy. Abigail. Don't you dare say my name soft like you've got the right. Was it a test? Yes. He wouldn't lie to her anymore. Not now. Not about this. It started as one. I've done it before. 4 times. Put on a poor man's coat and gone to look at a woman my mother meant me to marry because I got so tired of being wanted for what I have that I stopped believing anyone could want me for anything else. I came here to test you. That part's true and it's ugly, and I won't pretend it's not. 4 times. She repeated hollow. I'm the fifth woman you've lied to for sport. It wasn't sport. What was it then? What do you call putting on a costume and moving into a dying man's house and letting his daughter fall? She stopped herself so hard it looked like it hurt. Letting his daughter start to trust you. Start to... She wouldn't finish it. She swallowed the word whole, and it looked like it cut her going down. What do you call that if not sport? I call it the worst thing I've ever done, Nathaniel said. And I call it a test I stopped meaning 2 days in because by then it wasn't about whether you were good enough. It was about whether I was. And I wasn't. I know I wasn't. Abigail, listen to me. The money doesn't matter. I have more. I'll pay every debt. I'll destroy Blackwell. I'll deed you the South Field and the crossing and the road rights outright, all of it. You'll never fear another Crane as long as you live. Do you hear yourself? She screamed. He stopped. Do you hear what you just did? You just did it again. You just tried to fix the worst betrayal of my life by opening your purse. Money. Money. More money. You'll pay this. You'll destroy that. You'll deed me the other. That's your answer to everything, isn't it? Because that's the only language you've ever had to speak. Her chest heaved. You still don't understand what you took from me. It was never the money. I told you that the first day, and you nodded like you understood. I said there were things worth more than a farm. And you sat there in your poor man's coat, and you agreed with me, and you were the richest man in 3 counties, and you thought the whole time that if you just spent enough, you could buy back the one thing I had left, which was a person I believed in. Well, you can't. You can't buy that. It's the one thing on God's earth your money can't touch, and you broke it on a bet. The yard was silent. Somewhere inside the house, faintly, Thomas Whitmore's weak voice called, Abigail, Abigail, who's there? Is something wrong? And Abigail Whitmore turned her face toward her father's window, and Nathaniel watched her do the hardest thing he'd ever seen anyone do. Watched her pull herself together by pure will, swallow her rage and her grief whole, and answer in a voice gone almost steady, Nothing, Papa. Nothing's wrong. Just a rider looking for directions. Then low to Nathaniel without looking at him. My father is dying. He believes you are a good poor man who saved us. If you have one honest bone left in your body, you will not take that from him too. You will let him die thinking well of someone. Do you understand me? Abigail, I'm not going to. Do you understand me? Yes. Good. She wiped her face. She straightened her apron. She became in front of him the woman who'd faced down Crane at the stable door, armored cold, unbreakable. Then here is what's going to happen, Mr. Harper. You're going to get your bag. You're going to get on whatever fine horse you've got hidden, wherever you've got it hidden, and you're going to ride out of here, and you're not going to come back. Not tomorrow. Not to the assembly. Not ever. The debt's paid. I have the receipt. It's lawful, you can't undo it, and I wouldn't let you. We're square. You saved the farm, and you can tell yourself that makes you a good man if you need to sleep at night. And Blackwell. I'll handle Blackwell. He'll ruin you. Abigail, without me standing between you and him, he will find another way. I have handled every single thing that has come at me my entire life, she said, and her voice could have cut stone. Alone. I handled Crane. I handled the merchant. I handled the whole town lining up to watch me fall. I do not need a rich man in a poor man's coat to handle Edmund Blackwell for me. I need you to leave. That's the only help I want from you now, and it's the last help I'll ever take. Go. He stood there. Everything in him wanted to fight it. He had the power to fix all of it, and here she was refusing the fix, and it was maddening, and it was magnificent, and it was entirely completely her, and he understood with total clarity that this was the whole tragedy of the thing. The exact quality that had made him fall in love with her was the exact quality that would never, ever let her forgive him. She could not be bought. He had known it in his heart. He had known it, and he had reached for his purse anyway, out of habit, out of cowardice, and he had proven her point with his own hands. "I'll go," he said quietly. "I'll go because you've asked me to, and because I've taken enough choices from you already, and I won't take this one too." He picked up his hat. "But I'm going to say one thing first, and then I'll never say it again. It stopped being a test. I don't know the day. Somewhere between the horse and the fence and the sound of you laughing over supper, it stopped. What I feel for you now isn't a rich man's game. It's the realest thing I've had in 10 years, and I ruined it in the having, and that's a thing I'll carry the rest of my life." He put the hat on. "You were right about everything, Abigail. Every word. I hope you handle Blackwell. I know you will. You handle everything." He turned to go, then stopped without looking back. "Your father was right too, about the horse. You can tell everything about a soul by how it treats a thing that can't pay it back. I just wish to God I'd remembered that was true about people before I forgot it was true about you." He walked to the barn. He got his bag, and Abigail stood in the middle of the yard with her back straight and her jaw set, and did not watch him go, did not let herself watch. Stared at the house and her father's window and the farm she'd saved, and would have to keep saving alone, and only when she heard the far-off sound of a horse on the road. A fine horse, she could tell now she'd been able to tell all along. Only then did she let her shoulders drop and press both hands over her face, and stand there shaking in the empty yard, where 9 days of something she'd almost let herself believe in rode away and left her with a paid debt, a dying father, a wolf still circling, and a truth she'd been right about all along and had never once wanted to be. Thomas Whitmore died 4 days later in his sleep in his own bed, with his daughter holding his hand. Abigail was glad of the timing and the terrible arithmetic of grief. He'd gone believing the farm was safe, and a good man had saved it. He'd never learned the good man was a lie. She'd given him that. It was the only mercy she'd been able to wring out of the whole rotten business, and she held it close in the days after like the one warm thing in a cold house. There weren't many at the burying. That was the town for you quick to gather when there was a fall to watch slow to come when there was only a coffin. The preacher said his words. A handful of old neighbors stood at a distance with their hats in their hands, and Abigail stood alone at the head of the grave dry-eyed, because she'd used up her crying in the night and put her father in the ground and turned to walk home to an empty house. Edmund Blackwell was waiting for her at the gate. He'd had the decency or the calculation to wear black. He held his hat over his heart. He looked to anyone who didn't know him like a grieving friend. "Abigail," he said gently, "I'm so terribly sorry. Thomas was a fine man, a fine man. You bought his death, Mr. Blackwell." She didn't slow down. "You'll forgive me if I don't want your condolences at his grave." "You're grieving. You don't mean that. I mean every word of it, and I've never been clearer in my life." She reached the gate. He didn't move out of her way. "Let me pass." "Of course, in a moment." He put a soft hand on the gatepost, not quite blocking her just enough. "I only want to say the situation has changed, Abigail. You must see that it has. You're alone now. Truly alone. No father, no husband, no brother. A young woman holding land that men with lawyers and money and the ear of the county are already circling. I heard about the road rights inquiry. Everyone's heard. They know what your South Field is about to be worth, and they know you're a woman, and they know a woman can't hold a thing like that. Not in this county. Not in this year. Now, watch me. I'd like nothing better. But I'm afraid watching is the one thing they won't allow." He tilted his head, all sympathy. "I heard something else, too. A strange thing. That your hired man, your generous drifter who paid off Crane, turned out to be no drifter at all. That he vanished the same morning a Philadelphia lawyer came to town hunting a missing landowner named Harper." He watched her face while he said it. "Isn't that peculiar, Abigail? A poor working man with a rich man's savings, gone in a puff of smoke. One almost wonders whether you knew, whether you'd made some arrangement. It's the sort of thing that could look very bad for a lone woman. The sort of thing a man could make a great deal of noise about if he were inclined." There it was, the threat wrapped in silk. Abigail turned and looked at him full in the face for the first time. "You're threatening to spread a lie about me at my father's graveside," she said slowly. "That I what? That I was keeping a rich man in my barn. That's what you're holding over my head, my reputation. On the day I buried my father. I'm not holding anything over anyone. I'm your friend. I'm warning you what others might say. And I'm reminding you that there is one arrangement, one single arrangement that puts every one of these ugly whispers to rest forever. A married woman is protected. A married woman's land is safe. A married woman with a respectable husband is beyond the reach of every lawyer and gossip and grasping neighbor in 3 counties. He softened his voice to velvet. "The assembly is in 10 days. I will ask you there as I promised. And this time, Abigail. This time you'll have buried your father and faced a winter alone and had 10 days to feel exactly how cold that house is going to be. And I think when I put out my hand, you'll take it. Not because you love me. I've stopped hoping for that. But because you're a practical woman, and practicality is a kind of love in the end." "Get off my land," Abigail said. 10 days, Abigail." He put his hat on and stepped aside at last, gracious in victory. "My condolences, truly. He really was a fine man." He rode off, and Abigail Whitmore walked into her empty house, shut the door, sat down at the table where 3 had eaten, and then 2, and now 1, and finally put her head down on her arms and wept for her father, for the farm. For 9 days she wished she'd never had, and couldn't stop thinking about. And for the plain hard fact that the wolf was right. She was alone, and alone she might not win. But she had 10 days, and she had never once in her whole life wasted a day feeling sorry for herself when there was fighting left to do. So on the second morning after the burying, she dried her eyes, harnessed Juno, and drove into town to fight. She went to the county clerk first, a dusty little office where a dusty little man named Petrie kept the records. She'd thought it through in the long nights. Blackwell's whole power came from the note, the debt. But the debt was paid. She had the receipt. So what exactly did Blackwell still hold? She wanted to see the paper trail. She wanted to see with her own eyes what her father had actually signed. "The Whitmore note," she told Petrie. "The one Edmund Blackwell held. I want to see the original filing, and any transfers on it." Petrie fussed and hemmed and finally hauled out the ledger, and Abigail bent over it and read, and went very still. Because the note in the book was not for the amount Crane had collected. The original note, the one her father had actually signed years ago, borrowing against a bad harvest, was for $200. 200, not 412. And there in the margin was a transfer, and another and a third, each one adding fees, adding carrying charges, adding penalties, until a $200 debt had swollen to 412 on paper Thomas Whitmore had never signed and never seen. "Mr. Petrie." Her voice was very quiet. "This note was for $200. "Was originally, yes." "Then how did I pay 412 on it?" "Fees, miss. Late fees, transfer fees, the carrying charges." Mr. Blackwell's agent filed. "It's all recorded, all lawful." Petrie wouldn't look at her. "Filed proper. Signed by the agent under power of attorney." "Power of attorney from whom?" "From your father, miss." "My father never signed a power of attorney to any agent of Edmund Blackwell in his life." Abigail's finger came down on the page. "Show me that document, the power of attorney. Show me my father's signature on it." Petrie went pale. It would be in Mr. Blackwell's keeping, miss, not filed here. So a stranger's agent added $200 of fees to my father's debt under a power of attorney nobody can produce, and you recorded it as lawful, and you let a sheriff serve a writ on it." Abigail straightened. Her voice didn't rise, and that was worse. "You know what that is, Mr. Petrie. That's not a debt. That's a forgery. That's a theft dressed up in your ledger, and you helped dress it. Now, miss, I only record what's brought to me. You record what's lawful, and a power of attorney nobody can produce is not lawful, and you know it, and Blackwell knows it, and that's why the fees appear, and the document doesn't." She was breathing hard now, but not with grief. With something better. with the first real weapon she'd held all summer. I want a certified copy of this entire ledger page. Every transfer, every fee, every date. I'll pay the copy fee. And Mr. Petrie, she leaned in, I'd think very hard if I were you about which side of a forgery you want your name recorded on when this comes before a judge. Because it's going to come before a judge, I promise you that. She walked out with the certified copy in her hand, and for the first time since the rider had come up the road and ended everything, Abigail Whitmore felt the ground firm under her feet. Blackwell had made one mistake. He'd been greedy. He hadn't just wanted her land. He'd wanted to bleed her white on the way to taking it, padded the debt to squeeze her, and in the squeezing he'd left a trail. A $200 note turned into $412 on paper her father never signed. That was fraud. And fraud could be proven. And a man proven a forger before the whole county couldn't very well stand up at an assembly and ask a woman to marry him for her own protection. She just had to prove it. In 8 days. Alone. The trouble came fast, the way it always did once she started winning. By the next afternoon, the whispers Blackwell had promised were everywhere. She felt them the moment she rode back into town for the second time, the way the women turned. The way conversation dropped when she passed. She'd known this town's cruelty her whole life, but this was a new flavor of it, sly and sexual and vicious. At the general store, a woman she'd known since childhood. A woman whose babies Abigail's own mother had helped birth looked her up and down and said loud enough to carry, "I hear you had a gentleman staying out at your place. All those weeks, just the two of you, and your poor father too sick to know." "My father knew exactly who was under his roof," Abigail said. Did he know the man was rich and hiding it and sleeping in your barn?" Funny sort of arrangement for a respectable girl. The woman's smile was poison. Course, respectable girls don't run farms like men and ride astride and face down creditors in the yard, do they? Respectable girls have husbands to do it for them. Makes a body wonder what else you do like a man, or what you did to keep a rich one around. The store had gone quiet. Everyone was watching, and Abigail understood in that hot, silent moment exactly what Blackwell had done. He hadn't just spread a rumor. He'd handed the town a story they wanted to believe, that the proud Whitmore girl who'd shamed them all by not needing them, who ran her farm and paid her debts and held her chin up while they waited for her to fall, was secretly a whore. It was the perfect revenge on a woman for the crime of not needing a man. And every soul in that store was hungry to swallow it, because it made her small, and they'd wanted her small for years. Abigail set down the sack of flour she'd been holding. "Sarah Coyle," she said, "I've known you 30 years. My mother pulled 2 of your children into this world with her own hands when the midwife couldn't come in the snow. She did it for nothing. She did it because a neighbor in trouble is a neighbor, and that's all the reason a good soul needs." Her voice carried to every corner. "And here you stand at my father, not a week in his grave, spreading filth put in your mouth by Edmund Blackwell, because he wants my land and can't get it, and figures if he can't have me, he'll ruin me. And you're helping him, for the pleasure of watching me hurt." She picked her flower back up. "My mother would be ashamed of you. I'm just sorry for you, because a woman who'll carry another person's poison to hurt a girl at her father's grave has got nothing warm left in her at all. And that's a colder winter than any I'll face." She paid for her flour and walked out. Behind her, the store was dead silent. And she'd like to have said her words, shamed them, changed them, turned the tide. They didn't. Not that day. She heard the whispers start up again before she'd cleared the porch. But she'd said it, and she'd said it, standing up. And she drove home with her spine straight, and that was the only victory available, and she took it. That night alone, the fear finally got in. She sat at the table with the certified ledger copy in front of her and did the honest sum. She had proof of fraud, yes, but proof was only worth what a court would do with it, and the court was a judge who'd signed Blackwell's writ without blinking in a county where Blackwell had money and friends, and she had neither. She had 8 days. She was a woman, and women didn't bring suits, and lawyers didn't take women's cases. And even if she found one, and even if she won, the whole town already believed she was a rich man's kept woman, and a jury was just 12 townsmen who'd already decided. She might be right. She might have the truth and the proof and the law all on her side. And she might still lose everything because being right had never once been enough for a woman alone in a hard county. For the first time, Abigail let herself think the unthinkable. That the practical thing, the thing her father would have hated and her mother would have wept over, might be to marry the wolf. To take Blackwell's hand at the assembly, and save the farm, and stop the whispers, and be safe, and spend the rest of her life paying for safety with her soul. She sat with that thought a long time. And then she took the ledger copy and folded it and put it in her apron pocket, and she said out loud to the empty house in her father's own stubborn cadence, "No, I'd rather lose it standing than keep it kneeling. I said that to a stranger the first day, and I meant it, and I'll mean it at the assembly, and I'll mean it in the poorhouse if it comes to that." And she meant it. She did. But she was so tired, and she was so alone. And 8 days was so little time, which was exactly when there came a knock at her door late well after dark. Abigail's heart seized. Nobody knocked after dark for good reasons. She took up her father's old fowling piece from beside the hearth, and she went to the door and she said, "Who's there?" "Miss Whitmore." A woman's voice, low, unfamiliar. "Please." "My name is Ruth Adler. I've come a long way and I've come in secret, and I've got something you need to see before that assembly, and if the wrong people knew I was here, it'd cost me my place. Please, miss, let me in. It's about Edmund Blackwell. And it's about you." Abigail opened the door. The woman on the step was perhaps 50, plainly dressed with the careful hands and watchful eyes of someone who'd spent a life in service. She came in fast, and Abigail shut the door behind her, and the woman stood twisting a shawl in her hands and looking like she might bolt. "I keep house," Ruth Adler said, "for Mr. Blackwell. Have done 4 years. I'm not supposed to if he knew I was here." She stopped, started over. "I heard what he's saying about you in town. The filth. And I couldn't—" Her jaw worked. "I've kept his house 4 years, and I've kept his secrets 4 years, and I told myself it was none of my business the things he does to people. The families he ruins. I told myself a servant's got no say. But then he started in on you, and I heard how he did it. The note, the fees, and I thought about my own girl who's your age alone in the world, same as you, and I thought, no, not this one. I won't help him do this one. Mrs. Adler?" Abigail's heart was pounding. "What do you know?" "I know the power of attorney's forged." The words came out in a rush now, like a dam breaking. "The one that let his agent pile those fees on your father's note. I know it because I watched his man Sewell do it. At the writing desk in the front room. Sewell can copy any hand you put in front of him. It's why Blackwell keeps him. He had one of your father's real letters, an old one, and he copied the signature off it onto the power of attorney, and I brought them coffee while they did it, and they laughed about it. Miss, they laughed about how the old man was too sick to ever know, and the girl too ignorant to ever check." Ruth Adler's eyes filled. "And I said nothing. God forgive me, I poured the coffee, and I said nothing. But I can say something now." Abigail could barely breathe. "You'd testify to that in front of a judge. I'll do better than testify." Ruth Adler reached into her shawl and drew out a folded paper worn soft and held it out with a shaking hand. "The old letter. The real one. Your father's true signature that Sewell copied from. Blackwell told him to burn it after. Sewell was going to. I took it out of the fire." She pressed it into Abigail's hands. "You put my testimony next to your ledger, and you put your father's real letter next to that forged power of attorney, and any honest man alive can see the same hand didn't write both. It's proof, miss. Real proof. Of forgery and fraud and every dollar he squeezed out of you on a lie. It's enough to hang him near about. It's surely enough to break him." Abigail stared at the letter in her hands. Her father's real true living signature, saved from a fire by a servant's conscience, and felt the whole world tilt back onto its axis. She wasn't alone anymore, and she wasn't going to lose. "Why?" she whispered. "You could lose your place, your character. He could ruin you the way he ruins everyone. Why would you do this for a girl you've never met? Ruth Adler pulled her shawl tight and moved back toward the door, already frightened of having stayed too long. Because somebody once did a hard thing for my girl when she was alone, and it cost them, and they did it anyway, she said. And I've been waiting 4 years for a chance to be that somebody for someone else. That's all, miss. That's the whole of it. A body can't pay back that kind of kindness to the one who gave it. You can only pass it on down the line to the next soul that needs it. She had the door open now. Use it well, break him. And miss, she paused on the threshold. I heard about your hired man. The rich one. The whole town thinks the worst. But I keep Blackwell's house, and I heard him rage about it for an hour, and I'll tell you what I heard under the raging. A man doesn't get that angry that a girl was kind to a poor stranger. He gets that angry that the poor stranger was Nathaniel Harper, and that Harper paid a debt Blackwell meant to use, and that Harper's got more money and more land than Blackwell will ever see, and that if Harper ever chose to stand up for you, Blackwell's finished before he starts. That's what's got him spreading filth so fast, miss. He's not afraid of your virtue. He's afraid of that man. You might think on why. And then Ruth Adler slipped out into the dark and was gone, and Abigail Whitmore stood alone in her father's house, holding a dead man's signature and a servant's courage and a fraud she could finally prove, and one more thing she hadn't asked for and didn't want, and couldn't put down the knowledge that the man who'd lied to her, the man she'd cast off her land and out of her heart, was the one thing on earth Edmund Blackwell truly feared. She sat down at the table. She laid the real letter beside the certified ledger. She looked at the two of them together in the lamplight, the truth and the proof of it side by side. 8 days. She had 8 days, and she had the evidence to destroy him, and she had a servant willing to swear to it, and she had, whether she wanted it or not, one card left she'd sworn never to play. I don't need him, she said to the empty house. The empty house didn't answer. I don't, she said again, quieter. I can do this alone. I've done everything alone. But she folded her father's letter very carefully, and she did not throw away the thing Ruth Adler had told her, and long into that night. She sat awake at the table, the lamp burning down low, staring at a fraud she could prove, and a wolf she could ruin, and a locked door somewhere in her heart she'd sworn would stay locked forever, and finding to her fury and her sorrow that she'd already begun to wonder where a certain rich man in a poor man's coat had ridden off to, and whether he'd meant the thing he said in the yard before she sent him away. She didn't send for Nathaniel Harper. She wanted that clear in her own mind in the days that followed. She built her case alone the way she'd built everything alone. She found a lawyer finally in the next county over a young man named Calloway, who'd hung out his shingle a year past and had more principal than clients, which was exactly the kind she needed, because a man with something to prove would take a woman's case that established men wouldn't touch. She laid it all before him across his little table, the certified ledger, with the swollen fees, her father's real letter, the forged power of attorney she'd have to force Blackwell to produce, and Ruth Adler's sworn account which the housekeeper had signed in a shaking hand and Calloway had witnessed and notarized in secret. Calloway read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at her with something close to awe. Miss Whitmore, I'll be honest with you. A woman brings me a case, I usually turn her away because the courts don't listen, and I can't afford to lose. But this, he tapped the papers, this isn't a woman's case. This is a forgery case. It's a fraud case. It's the plainest one I've ever seen. 2 signatures side by side that a blind man could tell apart. A witness who watched it done. A ledger that shows the theft to the penny. He shook his head. The only question is whether we can force it in front of the right eyes before Blackwell buries it. And Blackwell's got a friendly judge. Then we don't go to the judge, Abigail said. Not first. Miss, he's going to stand up at the harvest assembly and ask me to marry him in front of the whole county. He's promised it 3 times. He wants a public spectacle, wants everyone watching. The proud Whitmore girl finally kneel. Her eyes were steady. So let him have his spectacle, Mr. Calloway. Let him stand up in front of every soul in this valley, and let me answer him there. In public, with the proof in my hand. Not in a judge's back room where he can pay for the outcome. In front of 200 people who can all read a signature. Calloway went very still. That's Miss Whitmore. That's either the boldest thing I've ever heard or the most reckless. If it goes wrong, if he twists it, you'll have handed him the humiliation he wanted and lost your only chance at a real trial besides. It won't go wrong because he'll never see it coming. He thinks I'm a cornered woman about to break. He spent all summer teaching me to be practical. She almost smiled. I'm going to be very practical, Mr. Calloway. I'm going to solve every problem I have in one afternoon in front of witnesses he can't buy in a way even his friendly judge can't undo once the whole county's seen it. Will you stand with me at the assembly? A lawyer at my side makes it real, makes it a proceeding and not a scene. Calloway looked at the papers. He looked at the woman. I'll stand with you, he said. God help us both. I'll stand with you. That was 5 days out. And in those 5 days the whispers got worse, because Blackwell could feel her not breaking, and it frightened him, and a frightened wolf bites harder. The story in town grew teeth. Now it wasn't just that she'd kept a rich man in her barn. Now there were dates and details invented whole, and a version where she'd known who Harper was all along, and had schemed to trap him in another where she'd been his mistress for years. The women crossed the street. The men looked at her sideways with a look she hated worse than the crossing, and through all of it, she did not send for Nathaniel Harper. Though she knew now where he was, it was no secret once you knew his name. He was the great Mr. Harper of Harper's Mill, 2 days' ride north, and half the valley's notes ran through his hand. She could have written him a letter. Ruth Adler's words sat in her chest like a coal. He's the one thing Blackwell truly fears. One letter, and the wolf would run. She didn't write it. She told herself it was pride. It wasn't only pride. It was that she needed in her bones to win this thing herself. Because if Nathaniel Harper rode in and saved her, then Blackwell was right, and the town was right, and her whole life was a lie. A woman couldn't hold her own ground, couldn't fight her own wolves. Always in the end, needed a rich man to come stand between her and the world. She would rather lose the whole case than prove that true. She'd told him so in the yard, and she'd meant it, and she meant it still. So she built her case, and she readied her proof, and she did it alone, and she did not write the letter. But Nathaniel Harper had not gone quietly north to forget her. He'd ridden home the day she cast him off, and he'd been useless ever since. His steward found him staring out windows. His mother, who'd been trying to marry him off for 6 years, took one look at his face and stopped mentioning it, which frightened him more than anything, because it meant she'd seen something in him she'd never seen before. He didn't tell her what had happened. He couldn't put it in words that didn't damn him. He did one thing, though, quietly. He set his men to finding out everything there was to know about Edmund Blackwell. It wasn't hard. A rich man asking questions gets answers a poor woman never could. Within a week, he had the whole picture: Blackwell's debts, which were worse than anyone knew; Blackwell's scheme with the road, which depended entirely on getting Whitmore land before the survey was made public; and Blackwell's ruin, which was coming fast because the man had borrowed against land he didn't yet own, and the notes were coming due. Nathaniel could have destroyed him with a word to the right banker. He'd bought and sold men like Blackwell before breakfast. He didn't do it. He sat on the information for 3 days, and he hated himself because he understood exactly why he was sitting on it. If he destroyed Blackwell, he saved Abigail, and she would never know, or she would know, and it would prove her worst fear that she was a woman who needed a rich man to fight her battles. He'd already taken enough from her by wearing a costume into her life. He would not take this too. He would not rob her of the one thing that was hers to win. But God! It was hard to sit still while a wolf circled a woman he loved. On the 4th day, his steward brought him a piece of news that changed everything. "There's talk out of the valley, sir. Blackwell means to propose to the Whitmore girl at the harvest assembly. Public. And—" The steward hesitated. "The girl's been to a lawyer. Young fellow next county. Word is, she's building some kind of case. Fraud, they say, against Blackwell. Means to bring it. Some folks say she's mad to try a woman alone against a man with a friendly judge." Nathaniel put down his pen. "She's building a case," he said slowly. Herself. Against Blackwell. Yes, sir. Alone near as anyone can tell. Won't take help. Turned away 2 neighbors who offered folks say told them she'd stand on her own feet or not at all. And Nathaniel Harper began for the first time in weeks to smile. Because of course she was. Of course she hadn't broken. And of course she hadn't run. And of course she hadn't written to him for rescue. She was doing exactly what she'd told him she'd do in the yard, handling it. Alone. The way she handled everything. And in that moment, he understood 2 things with total clarity. The first was that he had been right to sit on his hands, right not to ride in and crush Blackwell for her, because that was the one thing that would have proven her small. And the second was that there was a difference, a world of difference between fighting a woman's battle for her and standing behind her while she fought it herself. He'd been trying to figure out how to atone, how to prove the thing he'd said in the yard was true. And he'd been thinking about it all wrong, thinking about it like a rich man thinking the way to make it right was to do something grand, to swoop in and fix it, to spend and to rescue and to save. That was the same mistake. That was reaching for his purse. That was the whole disease. The way to make it right wasn't to fight her wolf for her. It was to hand her a sharper knife and then step back and let her do the killing. He called for his horse. The harvest assembly filled the county hall to bursting. Everyone came, the farmers and their wives, the merchants, the gentry, the young folk hoping to dance, the old folk hoping to gossip. It was the event of the year. And this year, everyone came for one reason above all others. Though they'd not have said it aloud, they came to watch Edmund Blackwell propose to the ruined Whitmore girl, and they came to see whether she'd take him. Half hoped she would for the romance of it. Half hoped she'd refuse for the spectacle. All of them had read her in the town's ugly story, and all of them thought they knew her, and not one of them knew her at all. Abigail came in on Calloway's arm. She wore black still for her father, and she held her head the way she'd held it at the stable door, and she felt every eye in the room land on her and slide away and come back. She heard the whispers. She let them break over her like water over stone. She had the ledger and the letter and the forged deed she'd forced Calloway to demand from Blackwell's own lawyer under threat of subpoena, which Blackwell had produced arrogant, certain no one would ever compare it to anything. And she had Ruth Adler seated quietly at the back, in a plain bonnet, twisting her shawl, terrified, brave. She had everything she needed. She only had to wait for the wolf to stand up. She didn't have to wait long. Blackwell had timed it for the height of the evening after the dancing had begun, and stopped when the room was warm and full, and every eye was free. He mounted the low platform at the head of the hall where the fiddlers had played, and he raised his hands for quiet, and he got it instantly because everyone had been waiting. "Friends," he called. "Neighbors, I'll not keep you long from the dancing, but some things a man should do in the open before the whole community, and this is one." He turned and he found Abigail in the crowd, and he smiled his velvet smile. "Most of you know the sorrows that have visited the Whitmore family this hard summer. The loss of good Thomas. God rest him. The debts. The struggles of a young woman left all alone." He put a hand to his heart. "And most of you know that I have long held an affection for his daughter, that I have tried in my humble way to be a friend to her in her troubles. Tonight, before all of you, I mean to ask her to let me be more than a friend." He extended his hand toward her across the whole silent room. "Abigail Whitmore, will you do me the honor? Will you let me lift these burdens from your shoulders forever? Will you be my wife?" The room held its breath. And Abigail Whitmore stepped forward out of the crowd into the open space before the platform, and she did not take his hand. "Before I answer Mr. Blackwell," she said, and her clear voice carried to every corner, "I'd like to settle our accounts, in front of these witnesses, since you're so fond of doing things in the open." A murmur ran through the hall. Blackwell's smile flickered. "Abigail, this is hardly the—" "You held a note on my father." She didn't stop. She reached into the bag on her arm and drew out the certified ledger copy and held it up. "This is the county's own record of it, certified by the clerk. The note my father signed was for $200, but by the time your man Crane collected it, it had become $412. Would you tell these good people how a $200 debt doubled? I have it here to the penny. Fees, carrying charges, penalties. $212 of them. Added by an agent of yours under a power of attorney that my father supposedly signed. The murmur grew. Blackwell's face had gone tight. Debts accrue fees. It's the way of business. If you'd paid on time. My father never signed a power of attorney to your agent. Abigail's voice rose over his ringing now. He never signed away the right to have his debt padded, and I can prove it. Mr. Calloway. Calloway stepped up beside her and produced 2 papers and held them high, one in each hand. This, he called, is the power of attorney. Mr. Blackwell's own lawyer produced 3 days ago under legal demand bearing the signature of Thomas Whitmore. And this, he raised the other, is a letter written by Thomas Whitmore 2 years ago. His signature witnessed at the time by the bank itself beyond any dispute. I invite any man in this room to come forward and look at the 2 signatures side by side. Come, look. And tell your neighbors whether the same hand wrote both. There was a terrible pause. And then the county judge himself, the very judge who'd signed Blackwell's writ, rose from his seat, because he had to, because 200 people were watching, and he came to the platform, and he took the 2 papers, and he looked at them. And the whole room watched his face change. These signatures, the judge said slowly, heavily, are not written by the same hand. He looked up. The one on the power of attorney is it's a forgery. A clumsy one. I can see it from here. The hall erupted. Blackwell's voice cut through it, fast, desperate now. This is absurd. This is a grieving girl's fantasy. My agent Sewell handled the paperwork. If there's any irregularity, it's his doing. I knew nothing of it. He knew everything of it. The voice came from the back of the hall. Ruth Adler stood up. She was shaking so hard, the shawl trembled on her shoulders, and her face was white as paper, but she stood and she raised her chin, and she spoke into the silence her words made. My name is Ruth Adler. I've kept Mr. Blackwell's house 4 years, and I stood in his front room and watched his man Sewell copy Thomas Whitmore's signature off an old letter onto that power of attorney at Mr. Blackwell's own order at his own writing desk, while Mr. Blackwell watched and laughed. He said, her voice broke and steadied. He said the old man was too sick to know and the girl too ignorant to check. Those were his words. I heard them. I poured the coffee. God forgive me. I said nothing then. I'm saying it now. She reached into her shawl and drew out the old letter, the real one saved from the fire. He ordered Sewell to burn the letter he copied from after. I took it out of the flames. It's the same letter you're holding, sir. The real one. That's how I know. The hall had gone from uproar to a silence so complete it hurt. Blackwell stood on his platform and looked out at 200 faces turning against him one by one, and Abigail watched the exact moment he understood he'd lost. Watched the velvet crack and fall away and leave the real thing underneath, which was small and cornered and full of hate. You conniving little... He rounded on Abigail, and the mask was entirely gone. Now, his voice shaking with fury. You think this saves you? You think a servant's word and a farm girl's tricks mean anything? I own half the paper in this valley. I'll bury you in courts for 10 years. You'll do nothing. The judge's voice was cold as January. Mr. Blackwell, you'll present yourself to the county court Monday morning to answer a charge of forgery, and I'd advise you to bring a good deal better explanation than the one I just heard. Because on the evidence before me tonight in front of these witnesses, you're a forger and a fraud, and I signed a writ on your lie, and I don't forget being made a fool of. He turned his back on Blackwell, which in that room at that moment was a kind of execution. Miss Whitmore, on behalf of a court that failed you, I'll say it plain, your father's debt is void. The fraudulent portion never existed. And I'll hear your suit against this man Monday with my own ears, and no favors owed to anybody. Edmund Blackwell stood alone on the platform in a room full of people who would not look at him. His scheme was dead. His forgery was public. His debts that had depended on getting her land would come due now with nothing to pay them, and every soul in that hall knew it. He'd come to lift the burdens from a woman's shoulders, and instead, he'd been broken across his own trap in front of the entire county by a farm girl he'd called too ignorant to check. He came down off the platform. Nobody spoke to him. Nobody stopped him. He walked the length of that silent hall alone and out the door and out of the valley, and no one there ever saw him again. And Abigail Whitmore stood in the open space where a wolf had been holding the proof of her own victory in her own hands, having won it herself alone in front of everyone, and the hall slowly began to fill with a sound she'd never once expected to hear, aimed at her. Applause. The very people who'd crossed the street from her. The women who'd carried Blackwell's filth. Sarah Coyle in the third row, with tears standing in her eyes and shame on her face. They rose and they clapped because there is nothing a crowd loves like watching a proud thing get its due. And Edmund Blackwell had been the proud thing all along, and the girl they'd been so eager to see kneel had never once bent her knee. She'd stood. She'd stood the whole time alone, and beaten a rich man with nothing but the truth and her own two hands. It should have been the sweetest moment of her life. And it was sweet. But even as they applauded her, even as the neighbors who'd shunned her crowded forward, now to shake Calloway's hand and pat her shoulder and say they'd never believed a word of it. Not really even in the middle of her victory. Abigail found her eyes moving to the back of the hall past Ruth Adler to the doorway, because she'd felt it. Sometime in the last few minutes, she couldn't say when she'd felt eyes on her that were different from all the others in the room. Not curious, not gloating, not even proud. Something quieter and steadier and older than all of that. And when she looked there, he was. Nathaniel Harper stood just inside the door at the back of the hall, in a plain dark coat, having slipped in unseen sometime during the reckoning. He hadn't come to the platform. He hadn't said a word. He hadn't lifted a hand to help her or spoken a syllable in her defense, or done one single thing to take this victory from her or make it his. He'd simply come and stood in the back and watched her win it entirely by herself. And when her eyes found his across that whole crowded cheering hall, he did not smile, and he did not come forward. He only took off his hat and held it against his chest, and inclined his head to her slow and grave and full of a respect so complete, it had no want in it at all. Then he put his hat back on, and turned and walked out into the night, leaving her the whole of her triumph unclaimed and unshared, and hers. He didn't come back the next day, or the day after. Abigail told herself she was glad of it. She had work enough to fill a life. The court met that Monday as the judge had promised, and Blackwell didn't appear to answer the charge. He'd already fled the county in the night, leaving his creditors to pick his estate clean, and the judge voided every fraudulent claim against the Whitmore land, and entered it into the record that Thomas Whitmore had died owing nothing, which was the vindication Abigail had wanted most of all, because it meant her father had been right to trust his own good name. And then the surveyors made their report public, and the road was confirmed, and overnight, the Whitmore farm was worth more than every acre Blackwell had schemed to steal it for. The neighbors who'd shunned her came calling now with pies and apologies. She took the pies. The apologies she let sit where they landed polite and cool, because a body can forgive a town without ever again mistaking it for a friend. She was by any accounting anyone in that valley would have made a woman who had won. Land, name, safety, respect. Everything Blackwell had said she couldn't hold, she held and held alone. And she was miserable. She didn't admit it for a long while. She was too busy and too proud and too used to swallowing hard things whole. But it came for her in the quiet times at supper, at a table set for one. On the porch step at evening, where two people had once sat and not needed to talk. In the barn where old Juno would lift her head hopefully at footsteps and then lay it down again when the footsteps turned out to be only Abigail's. The horse missed him. Abigail told herself it was only the horse. 3 weeks after the assembly, a letter came. It wasn't from him. It was from Ruth Adler, free of Blackwell now and taken on as housekeeper by a decent family 2 counties over, and writing to say she was well and to thank Abigail, which Abigail thought had it exactly backward. But at the bottom of the letter, in a careful postscript, Ruth had written, "You'll want to know he never told a soul. Mr. Harper, He knew everything about Blackwell's debts weeks before the assembly. My new mistress's husband does business up north and told me so plain. He could have ruined that man with a word any day he liked and saved you all your trouble. He didn't. Folks up his way are puzzled by it. I'm not. He knew whose fight it was. Abigail read that postscript a great many times. She thought about the man who'd stood in the back of the hall and taken off his hat. She thought about a rich man who'd learned everything he needed to crush her enemy, and had sat on his hands for weeks in silence, letting her win, when winning it for her would have been the easiest thing in the world, and would have felt to a lesser man like love. She thought about the difference between a man who reaches for his purse, and a man who has finally painfully learned to keep it shut. And she thought about what he'd said in the yard, the thing she'd been carrying in her chest all these weeks, like a stone she couldn't set down. It stopped being a test. Somewhere between the horse and the fence and the sound of you laughing over supper, it stopped. She'd believed him then. That was the trouble. Even furious, even betrayed, some deep, honest part of her had known he wasn't lying about that. And everything he'd done since had proven it. A liar would have come back to collect. A schemer would have used the assembly to make himself her hero. A rich man playing a rich man's game would never in 100 years have stood in the back of a room and given a poor woman the whole of her own victory and asked for nothing. He'd asked for nothing. He'd been asking for nothing since the first day she realized. Since a stable door and 2 hired men when a stranger came through a gate for no reason but that he couldn't keep walking. She saddled Juno the next morning and rode north. She didn't send word ahead. She wasn't even sure writing what she meant to say. She only knew she'd spent her whole life letting pride make her choices for her, and pride had kept her standing through a summer that would have broken anyone, and she'd needed every ounce of it. And she wasn't sorry, but she'd begun to suspect that the same iron that had saved her farm was well on its way to sentencing her to a life alone in it. And that was a price her mother would never have paid. Her mother had married for love. Her mother had known the difference between the things worth being proud about and the things a body's just too stubborn to reach for. Harper's Mill was grander than she'd let herself imagine. A great house-wide fields, a working mill on a good creek. She sat her horse at the top of the drive a long moment and felt the full weight of what she'd sent away. This was what he'd left to sleep in her barn. This was the man who'd split her firewood and walked her dying horse till dawn, and let her father die easy believing well of him. She didn't go to the great house. She found him instead exactly where something in her had known he'd be out past the barns, at a stretch of fence in his shirt sleeves, mending a rail that had come down. Alone. No hired men doing it for him. A rich man with 1,100 acres fixing his own fence in the morning cool, because she understood now it was the one thing that had ever made him feel like himself. He heard the horse and turned, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. He stood with the hammer in his hand, and the wonder plain on his face, and she sat her horse and looked down at him, and 3 weeks of things she'd rehearsed on the road went straight out of her head. "Your fence is crooked," she said finally. Nathaniel looked at the rail, looked back at her. "It is," he admitted. "You've got the post set too shallow. It'll come down again by winter. I expect you're right." He didn't move toward her. He'd learned not to close the distance, not to reach to let her come or not come as she chose. "You'd know better than me. You always did." She swung down off Juno. She walked to the fence, and she looked at the post, and she crouched and checked the set of it with her hand, and it gave her something to do that wasn't looking at him, which she wasn't ready for yet. "You knew about Blackwell's debts," she said to the fence post. "Weeks before. You could have ruined him any day. You didn't." "No." "Why not?" "You know why not." "I want to hear you say it." He set the hammer down on the top rail. "Because it wasn't my fight," he said. "It was yours. And you'd told me plain in your yard that the one thing you couldn't stand, the thing that would prove every cruel word that town ever said about you, was needing a rich man to fight your battles. And I'd already taken enough from you, Abigail. I'd taken your trust, and I'd taken 9 days under a false name, and I'd very nearly taken your good opinion of yourself. That day I kept reaching for my purse like your whole soul was a debt I could pay off. I wasn't going to take your victory too." He looked at her. It was the only thing I had left to give you. So I gave it. I gave it by keeping my hands in my pockets and my mouth shut, and letting you win the thing you needed to win. It was the hardest thing I ever did. I nearly rode down to that valley a dozen times to break him for you. And every time I made myself sit back down, because I finally understood that the loving thing and the rescuing thing weren't the same thing. Weren't even close. Abigail stood up slowly from the fence post. That, she said, and her voice was not quite steady, is the first thing you've ever said to me that a rich man couldn't have bought. I know, he said. It cost me more than money ever did. She looked at him then. Really looked. And she saw a man who'd changed not in his face but underneath it. The restlessness she'd never quite understood in the barnyard was gone out of him. He'd found something in that long silence, in that terrible patience, in the choosing over and over not to save her. He'd found out what he was made of when he couldn't buy his way through. And it turned out he was made of better stuff than either of them had known. I was so angry at you, she said. You have to understand. It wasn't the money, and it wasn't even the lie in the end. It was that you made me feel like a fool. I'd let myself... She stopped. Made herself go on because she'd come all this way to stop letting pride make her choices. I'd let myself start to care for a poor man who was kind. And then he turned out not to exist. You understand, I didn't just lose you, I lost him. The man in the barn. He was never real, and I'd given him something real, and I couldn't get it back. He was real? Nathaniel said quietly. He was a costume. No. He shook his head. The costume was the coat and the false name. The rest of him, the man who split your wood and walked your horse and sat at your father's table and couldn't stop thinking about the sound of you laughing. That was me, Abigail. That was the realest I've been in 10 years. I put on a poor man's coat to find out if a woman could be good with nothing to gain. And what happened instead was that a poor man's coat let me find out who I was, when nobody knew to flatter me or fear me or want my money. I was better in your barn than I've ever been in that house behind me. You didn't fall for a man who doesn't exist. You fell for the only version of me that was ever true. I just did it wearing a lie, and that's the sin I'll answer for the rest of my life. But the man... His voice roughened. The man was real. He's standing right here. He never left. He's just not wearing the coat anymore. The morning was very quiet around them. I didn't come here to marry you, Abigail said. I know. I mean it. I didn't ride 2 days to fall into your arms and be grateful. I've had my fill of men who wanted me grateful. I don't want you grateful. He said it fast and plain and true. God. Abigail, gratitude is the last thing on earth I want from you. I've had women grateful. I've had women want my name and my land and the safety of me. I never once had a woman look at me the way you looked at me over a plate of beans before you knew I had a dime. That's the only thing I've ever wanted, and it's the one thing I can't buy, and you're the only person alive who ever gave it to me for free. He took one step toward her, then stopped himself, that hard-learned discipline. I'm not asking you for anything. I told you that in the yard, and I meant it. If you rode up here to tell me you can't forgive it, I'll hear that, and I'll deed you the road rights I promised anyway, and I'll never trouble you again. That offer's got no strings, and never did. But if there's any part of you that came up this drive for a reason you haven't said yet... He looked at her. Then say it, Abigail, because I've spent my whole life around people who talk in circles to get what they want, and you're the only one who ever just said the true thing plain. And I'd hate for you to start hedging now on my account. And Abigail Whitmore, who had faced down 2 hired men at a stable door, and a whole town's cruelty in a general store, and a wolf in front of 200 people, found that this was the hardest thing she'd ever had to do, because there was no iron that helped with it, no pride to stand on, nothing to protect her at all. So she just said the true thing, plain. I missed you. She said. Not the money, not the rescue, you, the man who couldn't keep walking. I've had everything I ever fought for these 3 weeks, the land and the name and the winning of it all myself. And I've sat at a table set for one every night of it, and I have never in my life been so lonesome. And I got a letter that said, you never told a soul what you'd done, that you let me win it alone on purpose. And I sat, and I read it 100 times, and I finally understood that the man in the barn was real, because a costume couldn't have done that. A costume wants credit. You didn't want credit. You wanted me to have something that was mine. Her eyes were bright, and she let them be. I don't need you, Nathaniel Harper. I want that clear between us now and always. I proved I don't need any man to fight my wolves. But I've learned there's a difference between needing a person and wanting them, and I think it took me a whole summer and a dead father and a fled scoundrel to learn it, and I'm slow. But I learn. She swallowed. I don't need you. I just don't want to sit at a table set for one anymore, when the only person I've ever wanted across from me is standing here fixing a crooked fence and telling me the truth for the first time with nothing to gain by it. Nathaniel Harper closed the distance between them then. He didn't sweep her up. He didn't seize her the way a man in a story might. He came to her slow, and he stopped just in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head to hold his eyes, and he lifted one hand, those hands that had learned to split wood and mend fence, and he laid it against the side of her face so gently it was hardly a touch at all. Then don't, he said, don't sit at a table set for one, sit at mine, or I'll come sit at yours. I don't care which, I never cared about the table. Marry me, Abigail. Not to save you, you saved yourself. Everybody in that valley knows it now, and I made sure not to be the one who took it from you. Marry me because I've been the truest version of myself exactly twice in my life, and both times it was standing next to you. Marry me because you'd rather have me across the table than nobody, and because I would rather split your firewood for 40 years than own every acre between here and Philadelphia. That's the whole of what I've got to offer. It isn't the money. It was never the money. His thumb moved along her cheek. It's just a man who couldn't keep walking. Standing in front of a woman who never once needed him, hoping to God she wants him anyway. Abigail Whitmore reached up and put her hand over his where it lay against her face. Yes, she said, just the one word. Plain and true and given free. The way she gave everything, not out of need, not out of gratitude, not to be saved, but chosen clear-eyed by a woman who had every other thing in the world she could have wanted and wanted this one thing more. They were married in the autumn at the farm under the apple trees, where a stranger had once split her firewood. It was a small wedding and a plain one. She wore her mother's second best and pinned to it the brooch he'd tracked down and quietly bought back from the jeweler. The only gift she ever let him give her, that was worth more than it cost, and only because it had been her mother's, and only because he understood when he gave it to her that he was returning something rather than purchasing something, and he said so, and that was why she took it. Ruth Adler came and cried through the whole of it. Calloway came and toasted them. Old Juno grazed in the near pasture sound and gray and content. They did not live at Harper's Mill. That surprised the whole county, and Nathaniel's mother most of all. But Abigail would not leave her father's land, and Nathaniel found he didn't want to leave it. Either found that the great house up north had never been a home so much as a monument, and that a home was a smaller and truer thing, built out of a fixed fence and a good horse and a table with 2 chairs pulled up close. He installed a steward at the mill and moved his life south to a farmhouse worth a fraction of it, and he never once regretted it. And when people asked him why a rich man would do such a thing, he'd say only that he'd learned the hard way what a thing was worth and what it merely cost, and that the difference was the whole of what mattered. They worked the land together as they'd started. He mended the fences and she kept the books, and they brought in the harvests side by side, and the road came through the bottom of the south field, just as the surveyors had promised, and the tolls made them wealthy. And it changed almost nothing about how they lived, because they'd already learned the only wealth that had ever meant anything to either of them was the sound of another person moving through the same house. In time there were children. In time the schoolteacher Abigail had once dreamed of being. She became after a fashion, opening the first proper school the valley ever had on a corner of Whitmore land. teaching farm children their letters, the way she'd never been let to learn them past a certain age, and she funded it herself out of her own share. And she made certain every soul in the county knew it was the Whitmore school and not the Harper one. And Nathaniel let her gladly, because he'd finally learned that the deepest way a man can love a strong woman is to make good and sure the world knows which victories are hers. And the town, which had once crossed the street from her, learned to be ashamed. Sarah Coyle sent her eldest girl to Abigail's school, and Abigail taught the child as kindly as any other, because her mother had pulled 2 of that woman's babies into the world for nothing, and Abigail had decided she'd rather be her mother's daughter than her town's enemy. Years on, many years on, a young woman would sometimes come to that school, a farm girl with too much work and not enough hope, and find in the schoolmistress a person who understood exactly what it was to be alone and proud and drowning. And Abigail would help her quietly, the way Ruth Adler had once helped a stranger, passing the kindness down the line to the next soul who needed it, because that was the only way such a debt could ever be paid. But if that girl ever asked, and some of them did, whether it was the rich man who'd saved her all those years ago, whether the whole grand story came down in the end to being rescued, Abigail Whitmore would set down her chalk and look the girl square in the eye and tell her the one true thing she'd built her whole life on, and never once let anybody take from her. "No child," she'd say. "No man ever saved me. I saved myself, and I did it alone in front of the whole county. And then I chose the one who was wise enough to let me. That's the difference, and don't you ever forget it. A man who saves you owns a piece of you forever. But a man who stands back and lets you save yourself and loves you the more for it, that's not a rescue. That's the only kind of love worth having. You wait for